Okay, let's unpack this. We're starting with one of the most famous mental images in all of physics. The light clock on a moving train.
Right. If you've ever touched on special relativity, you know this one.
You have a light beam, and it's just bouncing perfectly vertically between two mirrors inside a box. That's your clock.
It's the perfect abstract machine, really.
Yeah.
But, the moment the train moves, the observer standing on the platform sees something totally different.
Yeah, they see that light beam travel diagonally, a longer path.
And since the speed of light is fixed, that's the key, that longer path has to mean it takes longer to complete a cycle.
So the clock ticks slower for the outside observer.
Exactly.
And that famous diagonal line, that's the source of everything, isn't it? Time dilation, length contraction. It's how Einstein mathematically forces the speed of light, $2, to be the same for everyone.
He warps space and time to keep that one law intact. It's elegant. It's truly beautiful.
But today, we are going much deeper than the standard textbook.
Our mission is to explore a really radical, very detailed critique of special relativity, or SRT, that argues that in achieving that elegance, Einstein, and physics after him, deliberately overlooked two monumental concepts.
The first one being the actual absolute nature of the electromagnetic field.
The very medium that light travels through. And the second is the physics of the observer, which our source material dramatically calls the camera eye.
So this deep dive is going to explore two key connected questions. First, is it actually, non-rational for modern physics to ignore the EM field's role as the single underlying reference frame?
And second, if you correctly factor in the mechanics of observation, why does the straight vertical line of that light clock inevitably transform into an arc?
Okay, so here's where the critique really begins. SRT's whole foundation rests on defining the speed of light, $2, as constant in every inertial frame. That's the second postulate.
And the sources we're looking at argue that this wasn't a discovery about nature. It was a policy. They call it a description system design policy.
A design policy. So Einstein made the speed of light constant in all frames, not because that's the underlying reality,
but because he needed a fixed rule for his mathematical system to function.
Wait, okay. Isn't that just semantics? I mean, why is calling it a policy a fundamental flaw?
Because light is fundamentally an excitation of the EM field. You simply can't separate the light wave from the field it's moving through. By making city dollar constant everywhere, the theory basically just seals away the motion of the EM field itself. And the colleagues here argue that the EM field is the absolute operational base for everything.
Let's make that more concrete. The sources have this fantastic analogy using 3D rendering.
Yeah, imagine the entire universe is modeled in a program like Blender. There's an absolute invisible Cartesian coordinate space. That's the foundation of the whole simulation.
And that, they argue, is the EM field.
It's the unmoving base upon which all motion is calculated. So if you ignore that base and try to define motion only relative to, say, a moving object within the simulation,
you create a system that is, and I'm quoting here, structurally inconsistent.
Precisely. So the structure of SRT is mathematically sound on its own terms, but it's missing a real-world physical anchor.
Which leads to this highly provocative claim in the material. It actually asks you, the listener, to judge whether it's crazy to assert that a moving train and all its devices are constantly at zero velocity relative to the EM field.
Which is what mainstream physics does.
That's a harsh judgment on one of history's greatest minds, isn't it? To call it a form of thinking abandonment or, intellectual sloth?
It is harsh, but the argument rests on what they see as a physical impossibility.
Okay.
Think about the photon sail concept. A light sail. An object in space interacts with light. Photons carry momentum.
Right.
So if an object is constantly being hit by asymmetrical photon collisions, say, from a distant star, its velocity relative to the EM field must change.
Instantly.
You can't just set its velocity at zero relative to the field and then just assume it holds. The mere act of illumination changes the momentum balance. Exactly. The source material uses this example to show that the constant $V$ setting is just. It's physically untenable.
So if the EM field is the absolute medium and its motion is dynamic, we have to treat it as the protagonist in the story?
Yes. And light must follow Maxwell's equations, which means it travels at speed, seeky dollars a dollar, relative to the EM field, not the internal frame of the moving object.
So if the EM field is absolute, then we have to completely rethink what's happening inside the light clock.
Mm.
And that brings us to the historical experiments, because if the EM field is the true reference, then the assumption that light moves vertically inside a moving light clock is it's fundamentally flawed.
The sources call this a Ptolemaic-like misconception. It's an observer-centric error, right?
Yeah.
We assume the movement is all neat and tidy within our little frame rather than in the big, encompassing field.
But hold on, didn't an astronomer prove this wrong centuries ago? I'm thinking of Bradley with his discovery of the aberration of light.
Yes, exactly. Bradley observed that because the Earth is moving around the sun, the angle starlight enters a telescope changes throughout the year.
Okay.
So for the light to travel straight down a vertically aligned telescope tube, the light ray itself had to enter the tube at an oblique angle.
The tube had to be tilted slightly to catch it.
Right. So the ray isn't moving vertically inside the cylinder. It's moving obliquely because the entire cylinder, the Earth, is moving through space.
And if you apply that to our light clock on the train, then the light beam is absolutely not moving vertically relative to the train's floor and ceiling.
No. It's moving obliquely relative to the train's axis. And that angle depends on the train's speed through the EM field.
And that leads us right into the great historical puzzle, the Michelson-Morley experiment.
When MM failed to detect the ether wind, the standard physics community made what the sources call an early conclusion. They concluded that light must move vertically at speed c dollars within the apparatus.
Which conveniently allowed them to get rid of the ether concept entirely.
Right. But the sources argue that when you combine Bradley's confirmed findings, that light rays do move obliquely inside moving devices, with the results.
The conclusion isn't that light is magically vertical in its own frame.
The conclusion must be that the light rays inside moving devices always move obliquely. And the degree of that angle depends entirely on the apparatus's relative speed to the EM field.
Okay, let's drill down on the consequence of ignoring that. We have to use that riverboat analogy again because it's such a great example of the misstep.
Yeah, think about a boat trying to cross a river with a really strong current.
Right.
If the boat travels straight across and back, and then it goes straight upstream and downstream, the round-trip times are different.
Because of the current.
Because the current is relative to the boat. The key is that motion relative to the medium, the river, or in our case, the EM field, must create a non-symmetrical delay in the time components.
It's like the boat's engine power is constant, right? Just like the speed of light, $$ is constant relative to the EM field.
Exactly. And if you ignore the current, you miss the true time components of the journey.
So by ignoring the possibility of relative motion to the EM field, physicists misinterpreted as proof that light traveled vertically, when the geometry of the universe, which Bradley showed us,
proves the opposite.
Yeah.
The light must be moving obliquely, even if we can't see the current.
Okay, that covers the first big flaw, SRT ignoring the EM field. Now let's tackle the second, which is maybe even more profound. The observer, the so-called camera eye.
The core of this critique is that Einstein committed a kind of intellectual sloth by treating the observer as an abstraction.
Not as a physical point in space who sees things with, finite mechanism.
He ignored the observer's specific position and the time it takes for light to actually reach them.
This is where we shift from movement mechanics to information geometry. Let's go back to the blender analogy.
Right. The 3D Cartesian coordinates,
Yep.
That's the calculation space. That's where everything truly is. But what you see is the observed 2D image.
Which the source material calls a deceptive picture.
It's deceptive. Because projection, like what happens when light hits your retina or a camera sensor, compresses 3D space down into 2D.
And when you compress that information, physical quantities like length aren't preserved. It's like looking at a photograph of a room. You lose all the depth, the true distance.
And even more critically, your camera eye doesn't capture an instantaneous now. You perceive the present moment, we'll call it $2. But the light rays hitting your eye at that exact moment.
They were all emitted at different past times.
Depending on how far away their source was, yeah.
So my perception of space isn't simultaneous. It's, temporally thick. A collage of different moments in time, all arriving at my eye at once.
Yes. And to reconstruct the true spatial image, the 3D structure, your brain has to retroactively calculate the true starting position and time of every single light ray.
Wow, so you're constantly integrating information from multiple past moments just to define your present reality.
And the complexity of this is it's beautifully illustrated by the Wimbledon seats example from the source.
Right.
Imagine 3 different observers. They're sitting in wildly different locations. Let's say you, me, and the umpire, all watching a stationary light clock in the center of the court.
Okay.
Since we are all in different spots, the light bouncing off that clock takes a different amount of time to reach each of our specific positions.
So even though we all see the clock ticking simultaneously in our own present moment, the light rays we're receiving were actually emitted at 3 slightly different moments in the past.
Precisely. Because the geometry of information arrival is unique to each position, each observer inevitably constructs a slightly different, self-centered spatial concept.
Your perceived geometry of the clock is unique to your seat. The umpire's is unique to theirs.
And all these individual realities are ultimately governed and maintained by that absolute operational base, the EM field.
That brings up a huge structural question then. If the 2D visual projection we see throws away the crucial time information we need to define true 3D space, how does physics ever restore that dimension?
This is the jump. This is where we go to complex spacetime. Classical physics used, let's call it single-entry bookkeeping. Everything was calculated with real numbers, like a standard ledger. But the EM field, because it incorporates phase and delay, it requires double-entry bookkeeping.
Complex space notation.
Exactly.
So the imaginary axis, the A that we all learned about in math class, it's not just a mathematical tool. It represents a physical dimension that was kind of intentionally discarded.
That is the argument. The imaginary axis, $, is used to represent the time component, or the phase delay. It is the mechanism that restores the dimensionality that was lost when we observe the light rays hitting the eye.
Help us visualize that restoration. There's this swollen wakame analogy. Why dried seaweed?
It's a great visual. So dried wakame, that compressed, flat 2D thing, that's like the image hitting your retina, it's a flat picture. The depth and time components have been squeezed out. But when you add water, which acts like the imaginary axis Adderall representing that time component, the wakame expands back into its original three-dimensional structure.
Ah, I get it.
The complex plane allows the dried 2D information to expand back into the full 3D information, including that time delay dimension.
That makes the shift from real numbers to complex numbers so much clearer. Okay, let's tie this all back to the dramatic conclusion. The light clock's straight line turning into an arc.
Right. The straight line path that Einstein used in his thought experiment. It's a mathematical abstraction of simultaneity. It assumes the light leaves the floor and ceiling and arrives at the observer at the same moment.
But it doesn't factor in the time delay geometry.
No, which, as we just established, doesn't happen in the real world, not in a world governed by the EM phenomenon. There is always a differential time of departure, depending on the observer's specific physical position.
Right. For the light rays to arrive simultaneously at the observer has to calculate the different departure times from the ceiling and the floor of that moving clock.
And that time difference, that delta, it's real.
So that time difference has to be integrated somehow.
Yeah.
As a spatial distortion or phase difference within the complex plane.
Yes. When this time delay, which comes from the finite speed of light, $, is factored in, the geometric tracing of the light's emission points, all centered around the observer, it does not yield a straight line path.
You can't.
Because time is now being plotted on a dimension that relates back to spatial curvature, it inevitably yields a curve, specifically an arc.
So the arc isn't the clock physically bending. It is the mathematical representation of the necessary geometry of information arrival.
When the full structure of the EM field and the observer's position are finally factored in, that's it.
That is a truly profound realization. It connects every single point of the critique.
It does. The theory of special relativity, by ignoring the absolute EM field and neglecting the geometry of the camera eye, basically discarded the very dimension required to accurately describe reality.
And the arc is the mathematical signature of that discarded dimension trying to restore itself.
What stands out to me is that this radical critique, it isn't about just throwing out special relativity.
No, it's more like an attempt to rescue the structure that SRT intentionally minimized, the full, rich structure of observation and the underlying reality of the electromagnetic field.
It's about moving from a convenient descriptive policy to a genuine description of physical nature.
And this brings us right back to those individual curved realities, the arcs of the different observers at the Wimbledon court.
Right. Each observer has a unique spatial concept defined by the geometry of light reaching their eye.
The ultimate question then becomes this. If our individual realities are all curved and self-centered, but they're all governed by one absolute operational base, the EM field, What might the complete description of that field reveal about how all these disparate realities are unified and maintained across the cosmos?
That's the piece of the puzzle you could take with you after this deep dive.